This week's session, we're going to talk about controller selection. And basically, just to start things off, I do not represent any controller manufacturer. Nobody pays me for anything related to lighting. This is basically my opinion. I'm not going to be pitching anybody's products. I'm not going to be biased towards anybody's stuff. Do your own research and kind of maybe help kickstart what you need to do to select your own controller or make changes with your display as you see fit going forward. So this isn't really to critique anybody's stuff. I'm not going to be weighting it any way or another. So I get that there's a lot of bias out there about which controllers are best and which vendors are best, and I'm trying to stay out of that and let people kind of come up with their own approach for how they want to do things and their own opinion. So, all right. First up, just to talk about what we want to cover today. Just a little about me, kind of overview of what we're going to cover today, a little bit more so than what I just did. High-level types of controllers, some details about how to extend your run if you want to be able to put things across your yard in a larger distribution. Also power distribution. So this kind of dovetails into what Bill talked about a couple weeks ago with power injection. This is going to be on the supply side. And also planning your layout, and that kind of pulls together all the subject material that we've covered here, plus some things that we've done in previous xEssentials session, and a little Q&A at the end. So moving on, a little about me. I've done a lot of stuff during the course of my career, both personal and professional. Kind of run the gamut in terms of a lot of different types of technology, software, systems, networking, and other crazy stuff. You can kind of see some of those things here. I also, on occasion, contribute some nuggets of code into the FPP source tree from time to time. And I'm usually here on the Wednesday calls. All right, to start things off. So I'm going to talk about primarily Pixel controllers today. I know we talked about before the session got started, just AC controllers, and people generally kind of get a sense of what those are, what they do. This session is really to talk about the Pixel side of things, and since there's a lot more to consider on that side in terms of how you need to put things together and what the vendors are and what the capabilities are. So I'm just going to kind of highlight the fact that, yes, there are AC controllers, but we're not going to talk about that this time. It may make sense to do another session specifically on that if folks find interest in it, but we're going to do Pixel controllers this time. So, and just in general, and what a Pixel controller is, if you're joining the session and don't know what that is at this point, it's basically a device that drives either a 3 or 4 wire Pixel as fed by E13 or ArcNet, and E13 kind of being the primary way that folks do that from xLights and from Vixen and from other schedulers and from other design applications. So we're going to basically be talking about the types of controllers that we can use to send E13 to from our sequencing software or our scheduler and drive pixels. And the types of pixels that you'd be able to run from here, 3-wire and 4-wire, not really elucidated specifically in this slide, but 3-wire being like a 2811, WS2811. That's one of the most common types that you'd run into nowadays, where it's basically a power line, a data line, and a ground line that constitutes the 3 wires. 4-wire pixels being like a 2801, which used to be the norm prior to the 2811s coming out, where they basically got a separate clock and data line to combine with the power and ground. So those are less common now. You're starting to see some controllers that no longer support the 4-wire pixels, and so you'll see kind of a mix of those that have them and those that don't. All right, kind of moving on. So I wanted to talk about both the wireless and wired types, because there's both different versions out there. There's good use cases for each, and we'll kind of talk about some of those specifically here. Wireless kind of gives you the flexibility in most cases where if you have wireless coverage somewhere within your display, you can add another collection of pixels, usually a string or maybe two strings, that you can actually run directly off of a handful of universes. I think the examples that I'm going to give in the next slide are basically lets you run up to, I think, 4 universes on a string. You still have to provide power, but you don't actually have to run like an Ethernet cable, and you don't need to have another separate controller driving it. It can actually run directly off of wireless. And wired is more your traditional type of controllers where you run an Ethernet cable to your controller, and then your controller has outputs on it that will drive those pixels directly. So first off, wireless. So some of the most common ones that you'll see out there for this are the ESPixel stick or the Renard ESP. These are both based on the ESP8266 and have, depending on what version you're talking about, a different board that it attaches to that'll allow you to run either pixels directly off of it or a serial output directly off of it. May require additional buffering or not, depending on the type. The one on the left there is the ESPixel or ESPixel stick, and the one on the right is a Renard ESP. Both, I think they now share a common firmware base. Originally, they were running a different version of firmware, but I believe now that they're merged in, so you can basically determine when you configure the device for the first time if it's going to be a serial device where it speaks DMX or Renard, or if it's going to be a 3-wire pixel device and it can speak WS2011 or GE color effects. So the one on the left there basically gives you input power. It's got fused output power as well as your pixel data that will drive it, and then whatever input voltage is passed on to that as well. So this will basically, once you do the initial configuration on it, allow you to drive up to 2 to 4 universes with reduced frames per second worth of pixels directly off of that ESPixel stick. The Renard on the right, I think, is more limited by the Renard protocol than it is by the number of pixels, so it's not really the same sort of thing. And DMX, likewise, you're basically just one universe because it's serial. But it'll allow you to basically plug into each of those types of devices directly. It helps in cases, I know, for example, I use one of these in my display. Some folks use numbers of these in their display, but being wireless, you kind of have to consider a lot of different things about your network. And I think one of the presentations we'd had, I think 2 weeks ago now, talked about just network provisioning and things that you need to be concerned about both on your home network and if you want to have a separate show network. The same logic applies on the wireless side, is that if you want to have guaranteed or reliable performance, you need to make sure that there's nothing going to slow it down or other traffic on it. Wireless is somewhat fickle at times, and if you want to try and use an existing device that there's a number of other devices on, say for example, your kids are playing with their tablets and your wife is watching Netflix and you want your show to go off without a hitch, you're going to be concerned about the overall network utilization on your wireless network. Is that because of the nature of how 802.11 works, 802.11 AC or 802.11n, before some of the newer technologies come in with the generation 2 stuff, it basically has to share that same bandwidth for all clients across. So basically, you got a high bandwidth consumer, it's consuming more of your overall network bandwidth. That's going to be less of an issue in the future, but for now, it's something that you need to consider. If you're pushing a fair amount of traffic over your other network, you've got one of these, one or more of these ESPixel sticks or 8266 type devices on your network that you're pushing E131 to, you potentially may see glitches or losses as that other network traffic potentially is interfering with it. You may not see it on your other devices because they're more tolerant, but SACN is less tolerant for that sort of thing. So that said, kind of moving on to the next class of controllers is the wired controllers. And what I've chosen to do here is basically break them up into small, medium, large, and extra large categories. And as you're considering your design, or you're considering expanding or modifying your design, this is something just to bear in mind, that you don't necessarily need to go straight in and buy a 16-channel controller or a 48 channel controller directly on day one. You can start small and work your way up. There is some advantages to buying up a little bit, give you some buffer room to starting with a larger controller, because you've got more headroom to be able to add on more later. If you basically paint yourself into a corner with the number of ports that you have, you got what you got. And then as it gets closer to crunch time, it's harder to get hardware to fill the gap. So just something to think about. So we're starting here with a mini type, and what I'm calling mini type is these are basically hats or caps that fit directly on a Raspberry Pi. It lets you run up to 800 pixels per string on 2 strings, so 1600 pixels in total, that you'd be able to drive directly from a Pi. It would run FPP, and then you could drive that from a scheduler either as a standalone instance, or you could use xSchedule and run directly from there, and it'll just play it through on your Pi. It basically gives you kind of a good starting point. I think these are on the order of about $35 to $40 each as a starting point, plus the Pi is about another 35 bucks as a good starting point to kind of get going with pixels for the first time. It doesn't give you a whole lot of capacity, but you can get a whole bunch of strings plugged into those things and start blinky flashy really quick. So it's just something to think about as folks start thinking about how they want to do their display. If they don't want to do a big investment early on, it's a good thing to kind of get familiar with and get your feet wet, I guess, to before you start buying in more stuff. Couple things just about the Pi Haps and Pi Caps. There's a couple different variants of them out there. I've just shown a couple here, one from Falcon, one from Crockett. They have some slightly different capabilities, and depending on the version that you're looking at, they may or may not have a buffer chip for protecting your pixel, or for driving, doing a proper line driver so they can drive a fair distance from the pixel and also protecting the GPIOs. They may or may not have a real-time clock, and the real-time clock benefits you if your Pi is not able to reach the internet. If it's on an isolated network, it will give the time accuracy needed to run FPP. And they may or may not have a DMX port. And some of the versions of this have a separate DMX port. You can actually have that in addition to your 2 pixel ports. So just things to look at. Kind of moving on to the next category of this is 4-port controllers. This is kind of the next step up. These are generally all E131 in. They have 4 pixel outputs, and they may, and I think all but one of these has, or I think all of these actually have a DMX port on them as well. Okay, one of them does not have a built-in one, but you can do a soft configuration and change the behavior of one of the ports. But they basically are kind of the first class of regular wired controller. You configure them with an IP address, either with a web-based interface or with an online, the LCD that's built into the device, or with a piece of software that you use to configure it. You have to plug it in. And basically from there, it'll receive E131, either broadcast, or I'm sorry, multicast or unicast, depending on how it's configured. On the ports selected. So each of the ports can have a certain number of pixels attached per string. Each of those is not necessarily the same number depending on the controller type. I'm going to post a link here in chat where it kind of goes through a good breakdown of a lot of these different types of controllers. Let me find my chat window here, stand by. Stand by. Here it is. Okay. There we go. And basically, this is something that
Sean Mahan, the lead developer behind xLights, is kind of compiled based on primarily on 16 port controllers. So this is something that you can compare feature set wise for the larger controllers, but it compares a lot of the different aspects that you need to be aware of for each of these controllers. How many universes does it support? What's the refresh rate? How many pixels per port can you run? Are there some other limitations that you need to bear in mind? Is there anything with the ability to adjust the RGB color order on each string or on each port, or is it global for the pixels that you plug in? Some things that are good to know before you pick your vendors. As with the larger controllers, the smaller controllers kind of have these same sorts of limitations. What voltages they will accept input, what are the fuses rated at for each of the outputs for those that do it. Does it have an expansion capability? Does it support some type of remote differential type receiver board or not? That's kind of listed on that page. So kind of moving on to the next order of size of controller is the 16 port. So a lot of the same characters that we saw on the 4-port controllers from the same manufacturers, just with more ports. They generally have, they all have 16 ports at least, pixel ports. They may or may not have additional DMX ports as well, so that you could drive additional DMX devices if you have them. They have their own set of limitations, and rather than going through and kind of reading out the matrix and comparing each one individually with the other, I kind of leave it to everybody to kind of go and take a look at that spreadsheet that Sean maintains on his website to compare each of these and make sure this is something that it meets your needs. Some are better than others, some are newer than others, some are kit, some are not, and some people like building the kits, and some people would rather buy a pre-built thing. So there's cases where each one of those, it may be a different decision based on what your interests are. Kind of moving on here too, just to compare, and this is kind of an extra thing, is that the more category is that given that the F48 is fairly new, it's a little bit different type. There are versions of the 16-port controllers and 4-port controllers that are not listed here that also support some type of differential. They call it like a pixel extender or something like that. I believe both Advatech and SAN devices have some variant of it like that is available. That basically allow you to, rather than have a pixel plug directly into your controller, you connect it into some type of a remote board that allows you to not be attached to your controller directly. That gives you some more flexibility with how you lay your system out. And speaking to that a little bit more, is extending your run. So this is something that just to think about when you're selecting a controller and potentially selecting your wire and other aspects of your show, is most of the controllers will have the built-in 3 or 4 port pixel ports. They'll be able to drive on the order of 20 to 45 or maybe more feet directly from the pixel ports. Most folks use 3-core wire of one type or another. You usually aren't going to be able to get much more than about 40 to 45 feet at best with the 3-core wire, 18 gauge 3-core wire. There's cases where if you're using shielding or if you're using Cat 5e or Cat 6, you can get further distances. But as a general rule, the unshielded 3-core cable, you're not going to be able to get a whole lot of distance out of that. So as you're planning your distance to first pixel, and this is important, it's the first pixel that is plugged into the controller's pixel port. That's something that typically the controllers will have different drive characteristics so that they can drive more or less distance. Most controllers can do about 30 to 35 feet safely. There are older versions of the controllers that didn't have good line drivers on them, and they couldn't do quite as much, and you had to do some creative stuff to get force a stronger drive signal from the controller. There was some tricks where you replace the resistor array on the pixel ports to get further distance. But nowadays, the controllers that you're using are pretty much standardized in the sorts of things that they use for that, and they're on par with each other for their capabilities. But looking at that, 35 feet, that's not getting a whole lot of room if you've got a large yard and you've got parts of your yard or in a corner lot, or you're doing your neighbor's house or something that you want to be able to extend out further. And there's a couple of the options for being able to accommodate that. Probably the first one is listed here as differential. And what that means is that it uses a pair of cable to send the data, a pair of twisted pair cable, to send the data down a longer wire without risk of corruption. And it does that pretty much the same way that DMX does. It uses an RS-485 transceiver, both on the sender and the receiver, and it's called the balanced pair. On what they typically use Cat5e or Cat6 for this. Cat6 will probably give the most uniformity on all of your pixels in terms of distance, and it can probably do a little bit more than 250 feet. But 250 feet is kind of the spec. And what it does basically in twisting those pairs together is it rejects a lot of the common mode noise and that you'd get on a regular 3-core cable without any type of extra shielding. Common mode noise is basically something that if you've got two parallel conductors running a long way together, you're going to induce noise into some of the parallel conductors from the other things or things nearby. And what they do is they basically run an inverted signal on each of those lines that's inversely proportional to the other. So they basically cancel out the common mode noise in doing it. So you can get much further distance that way. So it's really helpful if you've got a larger yard and you want to be able to run some portion of your display at a greater distance from where your controllers are. It gives you that flexibility to do that. And some of the controllers have a handful. They can do like a differential expansion board, or they may not have differential at all, and you'd potentially need to consider that as far as where you want to place your controller. Or they may have, like in the case of the F48, it's all differential. So basically you have to use your whole display is connected to the differential receiver boards. And in some cases, maybe if you want to home run everything back to a common point, it makes sense to do that. For your F48, you can put that somewhere protected out of the elements, run all your Cat5 or Cat6 cables out to where your display is, deal with your power separately, and that makes the most sense for you. In other cases, it may make sense to kind of collect bits and parts in different parts of your display. But just looking at this differently too, is that there isn't, if you've already kind of bought a controller, you've already got a controller, you're not stuck and say, oh, well, that means I got to go buy a Falcon. No, not necessarily. I mean, differential certainly gives you a lot more capabilities than some of the other options do, but there are options out there, and I'm listing two of them here. Kind of starting from the bottom, is that the way you used to have to do this is with null pixels. And null pixels basically serve in the capacity of, they basically act like a pixel in your display without an LED. So they will take your signal in, they will regenerate it, and they'll send it back down the line the way that regular pixels do on each hop. But being pixels, they don't have the same drive characteristics that your controller does. So it doesn't necessarily work quite as well. So you're going to get maybe 10, maybe at most 15 feet additional after that null pixel. So if you want to run for a fair distance more than that, you may need a whole bunch of null pixels to get down there. So another option that's come up more recently is the signal reconditioners or amplifiers. And they basically work by sticking them at a point where your signal is still modestly good. It may not be perfect. And they basically will help with a partially noisy signal to kind of square that back up again and fix some of the ringing and some of the effects of running a non-differential signal down these wires, and then be able to amplify it and drive it down the line a bit better than a pixel itself could. So you can add another 35, 60, even more feet directly. It basically looks, the output of which looks like a regular controller. So if you put it at a point where you're maybe 30 feet away, put another one of these other amplifiers on there, you can get another 35 to 60 feet from that point with regular 3-core wire. So it gives you some flexibility without having to commit to a differential. If you've only got a handful of props where you're going to need to do that, or a whole handful of strings consisting of a number of props, you can pop a couple of these things in there. The benefit also is that they don't consume a channel. So you could just find a point, oh, I got data corruption here, I got to stick an amp in there. You splice in your amp and you're good to go. You don't have to modify your layout, you don't have to do anything, and it will improve your signal down the line. So it gives you a fair amount of flexibility. They're small generally. They don't consume a tremendous amount of power, very little power yet usually. And I've listed 3 there that I'm aware of. I know there's some others that people have developed on their own that aren't really necessarily available for general use. The Falcon F amp, which I believe is going to be released very, very soon. I know David's been working on that one. The microamp or UAmp, depending on how you want to say it, is another one that's been around for a bit. And then the Rob G version of the buffer line driver, same general idea. They basically work in the same way. They're a little bit different electronically, but not in any significant way that you'd have to worry about. Very tiny board. You wire it in, you basically stick it in something that it's weatherproof and stick it out in your display. Some people take them and stick them in pieces of PVC. The F amp is intended to basically be left out in the elements directly. It's potted in epoxy and works just like a regular square pixel does. So once you get the connectors on there, I'm not sure if that's the final version of the design. I know David just, I think, posted that today. I was able to pull that image in. But we'll see once that's released. So in a general sense, that's kind of what you need to think about when you're planning out your display. So next part, and we'll get to there we go, power distribution. So we talked already in Bill Porter's presentation a number of weeks ago about power injection. So this basically is the supply side consideration of this. One of the things you always want to do is being able to fuse your cables, fuse your wires as you're building out your power distribution. You used to basically have to use like an inline fuse block. You didn't have a whole lot of choices in that. The inline fuse blocks basically either had spade lug connectors on them or screw terminals on them. They work well if you're talking about high current stuff, and they're intended mainly for automotive and marine use. But nowadays, you can actually get your hands on a distro board where it's intended more for how we use it in lighting, where the amount of current they support per port is a little bit less than the automotive ones typically are, but they have some features that are really handy in that they have a blown fuse detector that works usually at both 5 volts and 12 volts, depending on what voltage you're running. A lot of the automotive ones typically are designed around 12 volts, so the LEDs may or may not light up at 5 volts. Sometimes they're really, really dim at 5 volts. And the distro boards are designed to work with both. Most of them have little pluggable connectors for each of the individual fuse lines, so it's easier to get your wires in and out of there. The fuse block ones, you kind of have to modify the ends of the wires, and it may not be as convenient to use those. The smaller ones are typically designed for up to 5 amp fuses, and you can go down from there if you've got a smaller circuit so that you're properly protected. But also, I guess, there's cases in where you might want to consider the automotive or marine fuse blocks because you're using a higher current power supply, or 5 amps isn't going to cut it for you. You want to use something bigger, or you just need more. You can actually go and use these in their place. Again, you got to consider how you physically connect in with these devices. Some are only available in the spade lug style or the screw terminal style. So when you're connecting your wiring, you can go in there. But also too, the larger automotive marine fuse blocks are typically designed for heavier gauge wire. So if you're going to put a 30 amp fuse in there, you can use 10 AWG wire and don't have to worry about trying to get it to fit in those little tinky connectors because it wouldn't fit, nor would you want to for 30 amps. But most of which are usually designed for 30 plus amps per port, so you can actually put larger larger ones in there. If you're doing something from a common power supply and you're splitting out to a couple of other distro boards, it may make sense to put it on a fuse block because you can run 30 amps and fuse it there and then run it down to each of your boards if you'd prefer, with your heavier gauge wire, of course, to accommodate the higher current. And another one there is inline fuses. So if you're going to be doing just a handful of these, it doesn't make sense to use a distro board, or it doesn't make sense to use an automotive or marine fuse block. You can use an inline fuse. This is handy if you're, say, for example, putting a power supply in one enclosure and you're putting your controllers in another enclosure that may be some distance away, and you're having to run wires in between and you want to protect it. The power supply in general is protected by the overcurrent protection. It's probably not going to hurt it, but you might have other things further down the line that may not be so happy if you were to short it. So putting a fuse in there on your output on the power supply would basically protect your wire or whatever else it may be connected to, if you were in fact to get a short or go over the rated current of what you specify in the fuse. So these are generally available from 5, 10, 30 amp variants. Just bear in mind with the inline fuses to make sure you pick one that has both the current rating and the wire gauge to match. There's a lot of stuff on eBay and Amazon that will happily sell you one that says it's rated for 30 amps, but it's got 18 gauge wire attached to it. Not a good idea. So things to think about as you're picking your stuff. All right. Moving on here. Whoops, skipped ahead too far. So planning your layout. So we've talked about some of the capabilities of the controllers in terms of what they can do in terms of density, in terms of distance, and we talk about how to distribute your power. Now, you need to think in terms of how you want to have your display laid out, and that really will drive a lot of the kind of the refinement in both the power distribution and in your controller selection, or any just other modifications that you need to do to your design. Is if you've got a lot of your props in one place, you might want to think about potentially putting your controller closer to that location. It may make more sense to do that. Likewise, if you've got a lot of props in one place, you're going to have a lot of power consumption from that place. So it may make sense to locate power more closely to it, or provide for a higher availability of power in that location. Data source. So this is more for your controller. Stand by. Data source. So this would be basically your controllers. So I talked about some of the smaller controllers, some of the larger controllers. It may make sense based on which controller you want to pick and the distance that you want to locate your controller closer, because you don't want to necessarily have to add amps, or you don't want to go through the trouble of having differential as part of it. You may want to be able to put a controller right there. Say, for example, on your megatree, you got a high density, you've got everything right there in one place. You wouldn't have to go very far if you had a controller there, but you might want to stick your controller in the house or in the garage so that it's out of the weather or out of the elements. There's trade-offs, so that's something to think about. Power, so same sort of thing. If you've got a place where, say, for example, you got a separate breaker box that historically you were using for ink cans and now you're starting to do with your LEDs, it may be the place that you want to place the majority of your power distribution from. Or maybe you want to have it more distributed so that your power supplies are closer to the points of use, so that you don't have voltage drop and you don't have to worry about running heavy gauge wire. You can basically just run line voltage out to your power supplies and then handle your low voltage from there. So things to think about. And finally, some of the things that we talked about here. So pixel density. What kind of pixel density do you have in your props? In physical locations, do you have things like pixel matrices or mega trees in one place that have a whole lot of pixels in one place? It may make sense to put a controller that can manage that directly there. If rather than doing it with one master controller far away and then having to run everything directly there, and then having the extra componentry to support it. It may make sense to have a smaller controller to handle that if you've got a high power density, but not necessarily a large number of pixels being driven. You're running, say, for example, a 4-port controller, and you've got a pixel matrix with, say, 600 or 800 per string. You've got power injection there, but you don't necessarily want to run everything back and home run to a controller that's far, far away. You want to have something closer. Gives you some options. Low density props, things like roof line, yards borders, floods, which are basically just 3 channels for the 2811 type floods or DMX floods. Not a whole lot of density with them, but they may or may not have a lot of power required. Those generally give you some options depending on how far away they are from your controller. It may make sense to use things where you extend a run because you're only talking 1 or 2 strings or a handful of strings, a handful of extensions. You may or may not need to use differential for it. If it's, say, a roof line and you've got a 2-story house and your controller's far enough away, a differential receiver may make sense because there's 4 ports. You can drive 4 strings directly from that point. And then that you just use the differential expansion board for driving those, but the rest of it you're running directly off the pixel ports because they're close enough on your controller. Likewise for power availability, it may make sense based on what you have and what you're comfortable with to locate your power at a common point. You may have at some point put in an RV connector. We got a whole bunch of current in one place. And you don't want to go and run a heavy duty wire across your yard to run out to each of the displays for a different power supply. Or for decentralization, you might want to do that so that things are more isolated. If you were to have a failure with your power supply or your circuit, if you have a breaker trip from a GFCI, is that going to knock out more of your display or not? So is that a concern for you or not? Likewise, controller location. Does it make sense to have it more distributed? Do you want to have individual controllers for your collection of kit out in your display? Or do you want to home run it or locate things more centrally? And the size of the controller that you get, or sizes of the controllers that you get, can help determine that. The xLights project exists because of people like you. Help continue the project by making a donation today at xlights.org/donate.